Well, I've spent, I don't know, 60 years, maybe more, in the motion picture industry. I started around 18, working for two guys in Chicago, and I worked on the first gore films. I worked on Blood Feast and 2000 Maniacs and Color Me Blood Red, and I very quickly became a cinematographer. And then I shot some of the crappiest movies that anybody has ever made. Eventually, though, I hated all of that. I really wanted to make better movies. I really wanted to move to Hollywood. And so I eventually, over time, I managed to get to Hollywood. And I had a somewhat checkered career here. I'm a camera operator, sometimes DP on little tiny things. But then I was fortunate enough at one point, I guess around 77, 78, but a friend said, hey, we're doing a jazz festival in the south of France. You want to come along? And because I didn't have any other thing to do, I said, sure. And I landed in the south of France in Deauville. And I went down to the stage, and there was this thing. I looked up, and I saw this thing that I had never seen, and virtually nobody had ever seen at that point. And it was a long, skinny arm. And at the end of the arm was a camera. And the camera was panning and tilting by itself. And it flew over the stage. And as it flew over the stage, the camera pointed straight down. And I was stunned and amazed. And I knew that my life was connected to this thing. Now, so let me step back for a minute to the way cranes worked from the 20s or 30s all the way up into the 70s. And let's use I think the finest, conventional crane ever built, the Chapman crane. And how did they actually make this thing work? So the first thing you need to know about a crane is that it is a teeter-totter. And in order for a teeter-totter to work, you got to have balances at both ends. Now, in a teeter-totter on a playground, both sides, if here's the pivot point, you go as far from one side to the other, right? If it's 5 feet this way, it's 5 feet this way. But when you're in the movie business, you want the back end to be as short as it can be so you can get into tight places, and you want the front arm to be as long as you can be so you can do the most craning. So what the crane had evolved into was the Chapman. And the way the Chapman worked was it was a 25-foot arm that went out to the front where you put a turret. Maybe the turret is 1,500 pounds. And you put, let's say, 3 guys who have had lunch. Let's call that another 600 pounds. Let's call it 2,000 pounds out front. At the back end, it's maybe 5 or 6 feet long. So if it's 5 feet long and the front is 25 feet long, for every pound that I put out front, I need 5 pounds at the back. And that's a lot of weight. If I got 2,000 pounds here, I have to put 10,000 pounds back here. That means that this crane has to be enormously strong and braced. And it means, in the earlier days, grips. Picking up 30-pound lead weights, sliding them in a bucket, until you balanced whatever was at the front with what was necessary at the back. What Chapman did that was brilliant was they put a tank in the base of this big truck thing that carried it and filled it with liquid mercury. And when it was time to load the crane, they pressed the button, and whatever was the first part of the weight, I don't know, thousands of pounds of mercury flowed through tubes from the tank underneath to the back end, and then they threw some lead in to do the final balancing. That was what a crane was all about. And that's wonderful if you're doing this shot, if you're doing the camera rises up majestically in the air. And that's wonderful if you have to put the camera out over a swimming pool and park it there. But it is not wonderful for flying around. And what this thing that I have just seen, which is called the Louma crane, is wonderful for is its skewer space. Instead of carrying thousands and thousands of pounds, it's carrying 60 pounds of camera, maybe 50 or 75 pounds of camera head. But because it's a beautifully thought out system by a couple of French guys, it has video assist. It has a second video camera that's looking at the lens to make sure that the lens is holding focus because remote focus is new. Video taps are new. Every bit of this stuff is just coming into the world. So they have managed this complete package. And I was the first American to see it. And so I went back to America, and I got a job shooting second unit on a picture of Willie Courant. And I had told my friend, Bobby V., who owned a company called Film Trucks, about all this. And I call him, he says, I've been thinking about that thing that you told me about. We have to find some way to go after it. And I'm riding in the crew van with Willie, going out to some location. And I don't even remember the names of these guys at this point, but I somehow know it's important. And I say, so Willie, when you were working in France, did you ever see this remote control crane that can do all these wonderful things? And he said, oh yes, this is the Louma. And I said, you wouldn't happen to know the names of the guys who invented it, would you? And he said, well, yes, this is Jean-Marie Lavalou and Alain Masseron. And I said, far fucking out. I said, you wouldn't happen to know how to get in touch with them, would you? And Willie said, yes, I have them in here in my book. And he takes his phone book out, riding in the middle of the desert in Arizona, and he gives me the phone numbers for these two guys in Paris. So I know this is just blessed. This is just, you gotta go wherever it takes you. We get on a plane, we go to Paris, where we meet with them and negotiate that they will give us, I forget, 60 days, maybe it's 6 months. They give us 6 months of marketing rights, nothing else. But we can market this thing, the Louma, in America, and they give us a 3/4-inch tape of it doing an amazing shot, doing a shot that starts inside the window of a 2 or 3 story building. It starts up in the second floor, and it floats out, and it looks around, and it comes down, and it goes into a window on a lower floor, and some other action ensues, and finally it comes to a guy who's got a broken leg, and on his cast it says Louma. And so we take that tape and we turn it into a demo and write some copy that goes with it. And Bobby gives me the tape, and now I'm back in LA, and I'm who the hell am I going to show this to? So there was a hot director then, a guy who did commercials named Freddie Stenger. I said, Freddie will get it. So I make arrangements to go see Freddie, and I go where he's cutting, and we put this tape in the machine, and he looks at it, and he doesn't get, Andy, I don't know what I would do with that thing. But the guy who has shot the commercial for him is Stephen Poster. And Stephen is there, watching the edit. And Stephen says, I know what to do with this thing. He said, give me that tape. He said, I just shot second unit for Steven Spielberg on Close Encounters. He said, and he's starting this new movie, and Spielberg is going to go crazy for this thing. So I handed Stephen the tape, and it's the only copy of the tape I had. And Stephen takes it off, and nothing happens for 2 or 3 weeks. And then all of a sudden, phones start buzzing all over the world because Spielberg has finally seen the tape. So what is this thing? So Stephen is on his way to a film festival in France. And the French guys find that out, and they know what hotel he's going to be staying at. They put the Louma in a truck, and they drive to this hotel, and they set the Louma up outside, and then they call upstairs and say, Mr. Spielberg, please come to your window. And Spielberg comes, and he takes a look, and he runs downstairs, and he plays with the wheels, and he, swing the arm this way, do that. And we were done. We were completely done. He had it shipped to America for the movie 1941. And suddenly we were as big-time Hollywood as you could get. So I went to work on the show. And at that point, we began to figure out two things. And one of them was, what does this thing actually do on a Hollywood movie? And the other one was, how does it do it? Because nobody trusts it. And so, for instance, when we began, Stephen would say, I want this, I want some high shot, and they would put it up in the air, and we'd be looking through the monitor, and we'd say, all right, he'd say, all right, that's the shot, and then the grips would bring in a ladder, and they'd brace it against the arm and sandbag it so it couldn't move, and then they'd bring in another ladder, and Dickie Colleen would climb up that ladder and look through the eyepiece because nobody trusted the video tap. Nobody trusted any part of this process. And what we taught ourselves over the next 9 months, because the crane stayed on the show 9 months, was we taught ourselves what you could do with a remote crane. And Steven Spielberg and Bill Fraker created the language of the remote crane. They created the skewering through space. They created the moving over obstacles, the really fast arm that wasn't just an open fast arm, but a fast arm because you had dancers moving or somebody running, and the camera could suddenly, it could go there. And it was really a wonderful thing to watch. So of course, the first thing that happens is the Louma crane is not a telescopic arm. This is before telescopes. And so it's an arc. And we all know about an arc. There's a couple of problems in any of these kinds of cranes. And the first one is, as an operator, my lens is right on you. Maybe somebody's asked me to be fairly long, so maybe on a 75 or whatever. And I'm looking at you, and now we have to swing. And the minute we swing, the camera doesn't automatically pan. The camera stays right where it's focused, right where it's pointed. So I start to slide off of you. And then I make a reaction move, and I come across, but unless I am perfectly timed, we fishtail a little. And that's what we used to call it, was fishtailing. And we worked with intercoms to get past that. The grip would say, I'm going now. And as he said, now, you just had to believe and start making that move. But that was a serious problem, and one that we solved. That was one of the early ones that we solved. Ultimately, the telescopic arm solved a great deal of that stuff, because instead of moving first close, then away, and all those kinds of issues that you have with an arc, you can make it into a straight line. So the first maybe 5 years is everybody making some version of a fixed length arm with a remote head on it. So Bob Nittman invents the camera remote, and Laurie Frost makes the hot head, and then there's a power pod, and then there's a series of lattice cranes, much lighter than a Chapman crane. But they're steel lattice work, but then they're still a fixed length. You build them, it's no longer the whole crane comes as an assembled arm. You build 6-foot sections, you stick a back end on it, you throw lead in it, and now you have a thing sort of like the Louma, but it's still got the arc, and it's still got all of those other problems. So the next invention, the next kind of level of that stuff, is a guy named Horst Buberle, and Horst invents a telescopic arm. He goes to Henry Kraszewski, who's a European equipment company, and Henry finances the making of the first technocranes. And one of the people who works to do that is Simon Jays. And so Simon then, after they've built, I think, 6 of these cranes in Europe, says, let me take one to America. They agree to sell him a crane. Simon comes to America. I think the first picture he did was of Richardson, but whatever. The minute there's a telescopic crane and everybody says, oh, look what you can do with that, Now we start moving off of the Louma and cranes like that and into the telescopic crane.